Learn how to finish a seam with one of these 9 seam finishes and when to use them. There are different seam finishes for knit or woven fabric. The first is to zigzag the seam allowance together. This is one of the quickest ways to finish a seam. You don't need to do any pressing first, and you don't need a special sewing machine or tool. You can do it right on your own domestic sewing machine. This seam finish works well with both woven fabrics and knit fabrics, but the knit fabric would have 2 zigzag stitches and no straight stitch. First, you sew the seam with a straight stitch or a zigzag depending on your fabric, and then you zigzag the seam allowance together along the edge. If you are not along the edge, then trim the excess of the fabric so that it's right along the zigzag stitch, and then you press the seam allowance to one side. Zigzagging is great for most fabrics. For medium and lightweight fabrics, it can be a little strong and it'll make the fabric pucker slightly. It's best for medium weight fabrics. Another quick and easy way to finish a seam is to serge the edges together. A serger is a very fast machine, but it only does one thing. It wraps the raw edge with thread to give a really nice professional looking seam finish. It can be expensive to buy another machine that only does one thing, but it makes inside of your project look really good. Knit fabrics can also be serged to have a seam that stretches and finishes the raw edges, and you don't need to use your sewing machine. Whenever you serge a seam, make sure that you press it to one side to lock those stitches and to make your garment look really good and professional. Another way to finish your edges is to pink the edges. This is a very fast seam finish, and you just use pinking shears to finish the edges. Pinking shears are scissors that they cut in a zigzag. When a woven fabric is cut on the bias, it frays kind of like a fringe instead of full threads being pulled out. So pinking shears creates tiny little bias edges that will only fray slightly. This method is fast because you can pink the 2 seam allowances at the same time and then press it open or to one side. It doesn't look as professional as other seam finishes, but it works well to be quick. It does not work well for lightweight fabrics or fabrics with an open weave because those can still fray easily. The next seam finish is a zigzag overlock stitch. I found that it's called lots of different names depending on what your sewing machine calls it, but it's a stitch that has straight stitches and then a zigzag every couple of stitches. The straight stitches make the seam strong, and then the zigzag would help finish the edges. It's similar to a zigzag where the lightweight, it's similar where it can make lightweight fabrics pucker and create little tucks. This is a very fast way to finish the edge of a seam because the sewing and the finishing are all in the same step. But it's not always included on your machine. It's like a fancier stitch. You need to press it. When you're done, you press it to one side. It would not work with really stretchy fabrics, but maybe it would work with stable knit fabrics. I can't recommend this stitch for sewing clothing because I've never actually tried it. I think you should try it and test it out to see how strong it is. Once you have sewn it, you can trim close to that zigzag stitch to prevent any fraying or threads from coming out. The next seam is a separate zigzag, and this works well for medium weight fabrics, and it would make the lightweight fabrics pucker slightly. So what you do is you sew the seam with a straight stitch like you normally would, and then you go along and zigzag along the edge of each seam allowance. You should press your seam allowance open before you do this to make it a little easier, and it helps the seam allowance stay out of the way when you're sewing the other side. The next is a reverse French seam. If you forget to sew your seam with wrong sides together, then you can just sew a reverse French seam. This would work best on medium weight fabrics. You sew the seam at a 5/8 inch seam allowance with right sides together. Then you fold the raw edges in to meet the seam line and press that. It's a little tricky since it's a small fold and a small piece of fabric. This is great if you want a French seam but you don't want to sew wrong sides together first. It can be tricky on really lightweight fabric since you're working with small folds, so it would work well on medium weight to lightweight fabric. Once you have those edges pressed in, then you fold it together and press it again so that those folds will fold in to meet. Then you sew along the fold probably 1/8 of an inch close to the edge and sew with a straight stitch along, and that will keep that seam allowance together, but the raw edges will be enclosed. The next is a clean finish. A clean finish is a classic way to finish a seam and works great with just a sewing machine. It takes about as long as a French seam or a reverse French seam. It looks professional on the inside. It can get a little bit bulky when sewing multiple seams together, but it would work well for light to medium weight fabric. So what you do is after you sew a seam, you fold the raw edges under to meet the seam line and then press that. This is another place where you're working with small pieces of fabric and folds. So once you fold both edges in, you're tucking that raw edge in to meet the seam so that it won't fray. Then you sew along each side 1/8 of an inch from the edge to keep that fold in place and to keep those raw edges tucked in near the seam line. The next seam finish is a bias edge or Hong Kong finish. This is my favorite way to finish the seam of an unlined coat or jacket because you can make a really pretty inside. What you're going to do is use bias binding to enclose the raw edge of the seam inside. And so this is bias binding that I have already pressed, and I'm just sewing it right onto that seam allowance. Bias binding uses woven fabric cut on the bias, and Hong Kong finish uses knit fabric and encloses an edge with knit fabric. So they are similar, they just use different fabrics. It would be really fun to use bright contrasting fabric inside of the jacket for a pop of color. It works best with woven fabrics, and it can be done on heavier fabrics and lightweight fabrics. The last seam finish I'm going to talk about today is the French seam. It's great for unlined items and lightweight fabrics. It looks very professional and high quality. It's not very fast, but the effort is worth it because it looks so good on the inside. First, you sew the seams wrong sides together with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Then you trim the seam allowance to 1/8 inch. I don't always sew a French seam because of the extra time it takes, but I'm always happy when I do it because it looks so good. It can get bulky with seams crossing each other, and it's really tricky to sew French seams on any curves. Once you have that seam allowance trimmed, you flip the fabric so that the right sides are together and press a fold along that seam line. Roll with your fingers to roll that seam right out to the edge of that fold. So press that in place really, really well to get a nice fold. Then you're going to sew 1/4 of an inch from the folded edge, which encloses the raw edges inside of that seam, and your seam on the inside will be kind of a folded up seam allowance. I want to know what your favorite way is to finish a seam. Thank you for watching my video. I hope you have a wonderful day in all of your fun sewing projects.